Stanford Prison Experiment, when 24 young people forgot their true identity. In 1971, 24 college students participated in a psychological experiment sponsored by the U.S. Office of Naval Research. Divided into two groups, prisoners and guards, they spent 2 weeks in a simulated prison environment. The results of the experiment shocked the entire world. It became one of the most important case studies in understanding human behavior. Today, we're going to talk about the infamous Stanford Prison Experiment. The setup for the experiment. The goal was to find how an institutionalized environment modeled with power dynamics and manipulated role-playing impacts people's social behavior. So, in 1971, the U.S. Office of Naval Research approached Stanford University. They created a simulated prison in the basement of a building within the university campus and handled all the expenses involved. Philip Zimbardo, an American psychologist and a professor at Stanford, was chosen to lead the experiment. The first step was putting an advertisement that called for young men to participate in a psychological study of life in prison. About 70 applicants responded. Out of this lot, 24 men were selected based on the condition of their physical and mental health. Strong physique, sound mind. The experiment would go on for 2 weeks, and everyone would receive $15 per day. A group of 12 would remain as prisoners, and the remaining 12 would be the guards handling them. On paper, everything looked just fine. As planned, the 12 prisoners were picked up from their homes by the police of Palo Alto, California. They were arrested with charges of armed robbery and taken to the local police station. There, they were made to register with fingerprints and pose for mug shots. All the procedures required to make a legal arrest were followed. Later, from the police station, they were transported to the artificial prison. Professor Zimbardo was present during the entire process. Now, on the other side, the team of guards were given cops' uniforms and mirrored sunglasses. The idea behind sunglasses was to avoid any direct contact between the prisoners and the guards. This would project guards as cold and distant, strong authoritarian figures. They were to supervise prisoners all the time and maintain a disciplined environment. However, there were strict instructions against life-threatening violence. The setup for the experiment. All the corridors in the building's basement were covered with blocking structures to keep only one point of entry and exit available. All the windows were fully sealed so people inside couldn't figure out whether it was day or night. No clock were allowed anywhere in the premises. Laboratory rooms were transformed into prison cells. The cells had intercoms for general announcements, but they had been rigged to record discussions between prisoners. One big corridor area was designated as the yard for the prisoners to eat, work out, stroll, and socialize. But while moving through the hallways from their cells to the yard or to the toilet and then back to the cells, the prisoners were to be blindfolded all the time. Also, there was a small closet meant for solitary confinement, only 2 feet wide and 2 feet deep. It was called the hole, meant for prisoners who would act tough. The design of the prison was approved by experienced consultants and an ex-convict who had served time for 14 years. Since the duration of the experiment was only 2 weeks, Zimbardo came up with techniques to make the situation tense instantly between both the teams. Recording the reactions, the emotional state, and to what extent these two groups would go during confrontation was the whole point of the experiment. The place was under camera surveillance, 24/7. Someone would be watching and listening all the time, Professor Zimbardo and his team. Also, not all the 24 candidates would be participating. 3 from each team were to be kept as backups in case someone fell sick in between or some sort of arrangement had to be done. So the experiments commenced with 9 prisoners and 9 guards. The prisoners. When the blindfolded prisoners first entered the prison, they were immediately frisked and stripped naked. They were sprayed with disinfectant as a treatment to get rid of any lice or germs they carried. The idea was to make their welcome as humiliating as possible. Their heads were shaved too. No one could carry a unique look through their hairstyle. They were then handed uniforms. No undergarments were allowed. The prison uniform carried the prisoner's ID number, patch on the front and the back. No individual names were allowed. Each of them were addressed only by the ID number even during private conversations. There were 3 rooms converted into cells with basic sleeping cots and grilled doors. 3 prisoners per cell was the holding capacity. Next, the prisoners were made to wear shackles on the right ankle. This altered the way they'd sit and move around constantly, making them feel oppressed. All the candidates playing prisoners had signed legal consent forms. The guards. The team playing guards weren't provided any sort of training. They could make rules as per their convenience or as the situations demanded, maintaining certain limits. They were instructed to provide rationed meals for prisoners, which was meant to be minimally adequate for each person. They were free to invade any prisoner's privacy and violate whatever constituted as their civil rights in the environment. David Gaff, an undergrad from the university, was selected as the warden. He was responsible to manage the shift timings of the guards and the overall supervision of law and order in there. Wearing khaki uniforms and mirror sunglasses, they were to carry a whistle around their neck at all times. It was for their own safety. The experiment. On the first night, around 2:30 a.m., prisoners were awakened from their deep sleep by blasting whistles. The prisoners were asked to yell their individual ID numbers to give their count. This was the first night. Some prisoners didn't take the counting activity seriously, and the guards in that shift weren't fully committed to the task. But in the morning, the 9 disturbed prisoners barricaded the cell doors with their sleeping cots, ripped off the ID number patches, and even began cussing and swearing at the guards. The guards from the morning shift blamed the night shift guards for not being strict with the prisoners early on. However, something had to be done. So, guards from both the shifts and the ones kept as backup got together and started forming a strategy to tackle the situation. The first step itself was something completely unexpected. The guards brought the fire extinguishers and blew it at the prisoners through the grills on their cell doors. The chilling hit of carbon dioxide on the skin happens to be painful. Obviously, the prisoner backed off from the doors. Instantly, the guards rushed in, dragged the prisoners out of their uniforms, and lined them up. The prisoners who had acted as leaders of the rebellion were dumped into the hole, one after another. The beds from all the cells were removed too. The first rebellion had been crushed, but the guards were now staring at a tricky situation. They were to work in shift, 3 guards at a time, and 3 in backup who wouldn't be summoned as pleased. And so all the guards couldn't be available together to tackle such situations all the time. Also, this was just day 2, and so they had managed it somehow, but it couldn't be counted as dependable solution. So the guards came up with an idea. They converted one of 3 cells into privileged cell. There were 3 prisoners who hadn't put much resistance nor participated in heckling the guards. So these 3 were allowed to wear uniforms again and sleep in cots in the privileged cell. They were even permitted to brush their teeth, take a bath, and eat a better meal. The remaining naked, dirty, and hungry prisoners were made to watch these good prisoners having a good time. But then, at a later half of the day, the good prisoners were suddenly put back on the regular cells, and 3 prisoners from there were picked and transferred to the privileged cell. Now, these 3 received all the good treatment. All the prisoners were confused. Were there any traitors amid them who were putting the others in trouble just to gain some privileged time? The unity among them developed cracks. They didn't trust each other anymore. In fact, as days passed by, they tried being more obedient with the guards. The guards had successfully applied the age-old strategy of confuse, divide, and conquer. Next, the guards found more creative ways. If prisoners showed any sort of minor disobedience, they were made to perform push-ups. At times, one prisoner would be made to sit on the back of the other one doing push-ups. Prisoners started being quite careful around the guards, and soon such variations of push-ups became a common punishment for misbehaviors. Eventually, the guards were strongly bonded with each other. The difference between the 2 groups was clearly established. Now, prisoners were completely at the mercy of the guards. Even visiting the toilet seemed a privilege that could be earned through submissive behavior only. Any backtalk, and the result would be urinating and defecating in the bucket in their cell. This would trouble the other cell members, and life would get more difficult. The torture was slowly making them forget that they were into a role-playing program by choice. Prisoner number 5401 and number 8612 and number 819. Prisoner number 5401 was no ordinary candidate. He was a radical activist and had joined the experiment to expose it. He believed that the military was conducting experiments to find ways to psychologically control other young radicals. He even had a deal with some newspaper to sell the whole story. However, he didn't realize how and when he had slipped into the role-playing experiment. He possessed a rebel spirit, but suffered from smoking addiction. The guards had used this man's weakness to suppress his spirit. Then, there was prisoner number 8612. Within 36 hours into the experiment, he had started showing signs of emotional distress. He would suddenly break into tears or go mad with rage. At first, the experiment controllers thought that he was trying to fool them to get out of the experiment, so they tried various tactics on him. In one of the attempts, they tried to convince him that the other prisoners and the guards would mock him for being a weak person. Then, whenever the prisoners would be lined up for account, he would start yelling that no one could leave from there or try to quit. This was impacting everyone around quite deeply. But prisoners number 8612 didn't show any mental improvement. In fact, his condition was getting worse by the passing days, and so he was released from the experiment early. The guards had fully raised the bar for punishments and torture. They would perform the counting of prisoners more frequently and at random hours. Constantly yelling their ID number for the count made the prisoners associate more closely to their ID numbers than to their own names. Another miserable prisoner in there was prisoner number 819. As the story goes, at one point, Professor Zimbardo even made a priest visit the prisoners. Majority of the prisoners introduced themselves using their ID numbers. The priest had a chat with them. However, prisoner number 819 refused to speak with the priest as he was emotionally broken down. And to add to his misery, his refusal to communicate with the priest made the other prisoners chant, "Prisoner number 819 is a bad prisoner." They believed because of his insubordination, they would be punished further. Seeing his terrible state, when Professor Zimbardo offered prisoner number 819 a chance to quit the program, he refused. He said that he was a bad prisoner and hence wouldn't be allowed to leave. In that moment, Zimbardo realized it was time to end the program. Locked in a closed environment, unable to find out whether it was day or night, with no clocks around and being subjected to a highly controlled way of life, those men had forgotten that they were role-playing and not actual prisoners. So you can imagine how notorious the entire project turned out to be, how fragile a human mind can become when exposed to a disorienting and toxic environment. For more stories like these, please like, share, and subscribe, and don't forget to turn on the notifications. Also, please let us know what you think of this experiment through the comments section. See you again soon with another intriguing story.